The Artist's Toolkit, a training program for the artistic process, problems, background, and exercises.
Hello and welcome to the Artist's Toolkit. This is Kaethe Wenzel, and today I'm happy to welcome our second international guest. Nicholas Sinclair is one of the most important living British photographers. His works are in collections like the National Portrait Gallery, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Albertina Museum in Vienna, and so on and so on. He's especially well known for his artist's portraits, though personally I also like his other works a lot, especially his work about cities, graffitis, you could call it the skin of cities, and also about something that you could loosely circumscribe as body art, which may be connected to the fact that his career actually started in a circus. Nicholas, it's so great to have you here and to profit from your experience. What are your problems? What are your challenges when you make a portrait? What are you looking for, and what would you say can undermine a successful portrait?
Anxiety is certainly one of them. Photographs often show a person's emotions in a way that we can't always see ourselves. So if the person I'm photographing is either nervous or self-conscious, it will show. And it's understandable. They're in the spotlight, they're the focus of attention, they're expected to perform, and this can be unnerving. They may try to hide it, but it often shows up in other ways. Tension in the muscles around the mouth, for example, or in the hands. So I need to recognize this when it's happening and try to relax them. Talking, playing music, or simply by working through the process until they relax naturally. The tension will often disappear of its own accord as the session evolves. Another issue that comes up is how the sitter wants to be portrayed as opposed to how I want to portray them. There can be a disparity. I see them as who they are at that moment in time when I first meet them, but they may have a different vision of themselves, perhaps more youthful, more beautiful, so there can be a gap between what I want to achieve and what the sitter hopes for. I remember a well-known British artist saying to me, "I don't see myself in your photograph." In other words, she didn't like the picture and she didn't want it used, and it wasn't. So vanity is an issue I have to deal with. But the biggest challenge in every portrait is to find a balance between the aesthetic and the psychological elements. These are the two things that define a portrait. By aesthetics, I mean the way the picture is structured, all the different visual elements that go into making it. The subject to camera distance, the relationship between the subject and the background, highlights, shadows, line and tone, colour, movement, they all have to play their part. And then there's that elusive element, the feeling you have when you look at the picture, the connection you make with the sitter. Achieving those two things is what makes portraiture so fascinating. Frustrating, yes, because it can be so difficult, but always fascinating. And you also need to leave something for the viewer to imagine, because this draws them in, it helps them to connect. Something needs to be left open for interpretation. So I avoid expressions that feel contrived, the false smile being the most obvious one. To me, there are two kinds of smile. The smile from the eyes, which is authentic, and the smile from the teeth, which is false. The viewer will always feel manipulated when they see a false smile. So I much prefer a settled, neutral look.
So wow, that is quite a lot of stuff to keep in mind. You perpetually have to keep your antennae out. You have to be aware of so many levels of practical stuff, of emotional levels, of hidden messages. That is quite a complex task. Isn't that sometimes a little overwhelming?
Sometimes, yes. When I've been photographing artists, and it doesn't happen very often, I walk into their studio and I can't find a good setting for the portrait. I have no idea where to begin, and it's a horrible feeling when it happens. The studio could be a mess, visually confusing. Nothing suggests itself, so I have no starting point, and I find those situations very stressful. I'll give you an example. In 2017, I was photographing an artist, and his daughter was just about to emigrate to Italy. And she said to her father, "Can I leave my possessions in your studio?" And of course he said yes. I arrived to take the portrait. There were no paintings on the wall, no drawings, no reference to his work. The entire studio was full of her furniture and her clothes, and that for me is a nightmare situation.
And what do you do in such a situation?
I try to stay calm, at least on the outside. I keep looking, I try different camera angles, different backgrounds. I may go outside to see if there's a good exterior setting I can use. I would consider a close-up of the face with minimal reference to the studio. I'll keep looking until I find something that works, but it can be difficult getting there.
I think, what I find especially interesting about your work, you're like doing portrait photography. I imagine you meeting these people, or a lot of these people, you're meeting them for the first time. You've had no chance to get to know them a little beforehand. How do you connect? Do you get in touch with them? Isn't that kind of difficult sometimes? Can you make a connection?
I think so. I enjoy meeting people. I enjoy meeting artists, photographing artists, visiting their studios, researching their careers and their work in advance of a shoot. But there have been times when I felt no connection at all. It can feel as if they're blocking me. And I'm thinking, why did you agree to be photographed if you have no desire to engage with the process? And in those situations, I tend to concentrate more on the composition, using strong lines and shapes, so that the viewer is less focused on the subject and more focused on the picture as a whole. I think it's worth mentioning at this point, portraiture is a collaborative process. You both need to be playing your part. You both need to bring something to the table. And if the person I'm photographing isn't doing that, it can be difficult.
Okay, so I imagine this situation. You have a photo shoot, you come back to your workplace, you have a lot of different pictures taken from different angles and different locations. And I imagine that's quite a difficult process to pick the right one and to find out the picture that is just right. How do you do it? Can you tell us a bit about your editing process? How do you come to the decision for a final picture? What are you looking for? And what you do if you can't find it?
Editing, I think, is one of the most important skills to have in photography. To recognize and to select the strongest image from a shoot and to edit out the weaker images. To know what is working, to know what isn't working and why. Frank Auerbach, one of Britain's best contemporary painters, said, "The difference between a good artist and a great artist is in the editing." And I think he had a point. For me, personally, it's a very instinctive process. I go with my gut feeling. I look for an image that connects emotionally, that feels authentic. And you can often see this in the person's eyes, in their gaze, in what they transmit to us at that moment. As humans, we're programmed to read each other's emotions through eye contact and through body language. We do it automatically and unconsciously. As soon as we meet someone, we're reading them, looking for signs, hostile or friendly. It's a basic survival mechanism. And as a portrait photographer, I'm using those skills both to make the pictures and then to edit them after the shoot. But I'm also looking for good construction. The picture must work aesthetically as well as emotionally. I need to be feeling convinced by both elements, and if I'm not convinced, I can't expect the audience to be either.
And what if that doesn't work? What if it fails?
If I fail, then I'll discard the shoot. I don't want bad work to go out into the public domain. In the long term, it doesn't do your reputation any good to publish bad pictures. It doesn't happen very often, but I have discarded entire shoots if I haven't been happy with them.
So, Nicholas, this is a podcast that is focusing on challenges and problems in the artistic process and on how we develop individual solutions, personal solutions, because normally there are no general solutions. I'm sure we can profit from your experience. So may I ask you a bit about your beginnings? What were the biggest challenges when you just started out? How did you make a living? What was the biggest problem you had to deal with in the beginning when you decided to go for it, to become an artist and to become a photographer?
When I very first started out in 1982, I was working as a professional musician playing the drums in a circus, so I was being paid. But when the season ended and when I decided to become a photographer, earning a living was one of the first challenges I faced. If you're serious about becoming an artist, you have to think about how to support yourself. It's not a romantic notion, it's not something people want to talk about, but it's the reality you have to face. I've seen talented young people give up their careers because they couldn't pay their bills. So for me, it was always a balance between practicality and idealism. You need practical ways to pay your rent and a conviction that drives you forward as an artist. Having one of these isn't enough. You need both. I was very driven and very focused when I first started. I knew that I had found my vocation, so I worked hard, I put in long hours. I also learned different techniques so that I could work professionally. How to light interiors, how to light still life and portraits. I worked in hospitals, photographing operations. I took every job I was offered, both to gain experience and to earn a living.
I imagine that must have been an extremely busy life. I mean, working so much, such long hours, rushing around London and the countryside, rushing from the hospital to the studio. You must have been extremely busy. Did you have any time at all to look at photography beyond the technical part, beyond what you just told us about becoming professional, about learning about the technical side of things? Did you have any time, for example, to look at the history of photography? Do you think at all that it is important to know about the history of photography?
I would say essential. I began looking at the great photographers from the start, and I've always done this. It was the same when I was a musician. It was the same when I was studying painting at university. I was also studying the history of art in parallel. Whatever art form you choose, you should look at the history so that you know who's gone before you. Who are the important artists? Who were the innovators? What were they doing? Who's working today? And don't be afraid to be influenced by the artists who've gone before you, to acknowledge what's already been done. Recognize that you're simply making a contribution to a bigger picture. I think it's worth remembering that in photography, every format, every camera angle, every type of composition, every method of printing, they've all been done already, so nothing you do will be truly original. So I think just accept this and go with it.
Nicholas, you're definitely not a jack of all trades, but you're something like a jack of maybe all specializations. You're a fully trained painter, you used to be a professional musician, and now you're a photographer. And I'm wondering, what do other directions in art? What do they mean to you? Do you look at other art forms and learn from them?
Very much so. I think a wide cultural knowledge is invaluable for an artist. So I try to see as much as I can. And I always try to learn from other art forms. For example, if I'm in the cinema or watching a Netflix drama, I'll be looking at how a shot is framed. I'll be looking at lighting, locations, camera angles, makeup and hair, costume design, the way complementary colours are used, everything that goes into making the scene effective. When I see an exhibition of paintings, I'm looking at how the artist constructs the picture, how they use scale, colour, line, emotional power. I look at the way the pictures are framed and hung, even the spacing of the work, the way the pictures work together. And when I listen to music, I'm conscious of how a musician will shape a solo, for example, how they use accents, how they leave space, how they leave the listener hanging, how silence can be as effective as sound. So I would say take in as much as you can, let it stay in your long-term memory so that you can then draw from it in the future.
Yes, and I completely agree with that. I think I completely believe in storage, in gathering things that will help you in the future, solutions, inspiration, fragments of ideas, but also simply stuff that makes you happy and that gives you strength and that may help you through your life's crisis. And I'm wondering, I'm sure, do you sometimes doubt yourself? Are there these moments when you think, I'm failing, it's just too difficult, I can't do it?
I do, and I think most people do. It's part of being human. We all have doubts about what we're doing from time to time, experiencing different emotions, some positive, some negative, questioning who we are, what we're capable of. But you need to balance this with courage and a belief in your work. For me, it's important not to be arrogant about what I do, but to see the value in it, to feel that I am making a contribution. A career as an artist can be lonely. You have to deal with rejection, with people not understanding what you're doing. It can feel like quite a lonely journey sometimes. So belief in what you're doing can act as a handrail, something to hold on to. It sustains you when things are difficult. One piece of advice while I think about it: don't be taken in by what is fashionable in the moment. At any given time in our culture, there will be fashions. And there will always be people who confidently tell you what is cool, what is fashionable, what is stylish. And by implication, anything that doesn't fit with their view will be considered uncool. Don't be taken in by this. Follow your heart. Do what feels right for you. I remember I had just left school. I was applying for university, and a friend of mine said, "What are you applying for?" And I said, "Painting." And he laughed at me. He said, "Painting? Nobody paints anymore," as though I was from the 19th century. When I look back now and think of all those extraordinary painters who were working in the 1970s, Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, Francis Bacon, Lucien Freud, Frank Auerbach, Gillian Ayres, dozens of wonderful painters who were all working in the 70s, I can see that what he said was completely incorrect.
Yeah, painting, Nicholas. So I know your mom is an excellent painter. I know you're a fully trained painter yourself. How come you didn't end up painting? So why photography? Why not paint?
Because I think it suits my character. Artists gravitate naturally to an art form that's right for their character and right for their time in history, and photography felt right for me in the early 1980s. And I could also see that it was a way for me to earn a living, and that was important.
So you could say it was a simple solution?
It can be, but I think it's a mistake to see it that way. It's a difficult profession to survive in, partly because it's overcrowded, and partly because it's difficult to find your voice to be distinctive. Because it's a mechanical process, the choices are limited. You have to work in 2 dimensions. You have to work with either the square or the rectangle. You have to work in either colour or in black and white. So there are far fewer options than if you're a painter or a sculptor. There have been extraordinary photographers, of course, we recognise instantly. Julia Margaret Cameron, August Sander, Sarah Moon, Diane Arbus. But they are rare.
Nicholas, do you have a workbook or a sketchbook? And if you do, what does it look like? Because in this podcast, I'm always going on about how important sketchbooks are. So do you have one? And what does it look like?
I've kept workbooks since the beginning. I think of them as being like visual diaries, so anything and everything can go into them. Proof prints, writing, ideas, contact sheets, details of shoots, thoughts about how a shoot turned out, how I responded to the pictures. They're also like a tracking device. I can return to any shoot from the last 40 years and see the date, the location, the subject, the setting, thoughts I had on the day. And I also use them as a form of continuity. I keep them active regardless of what is happening in my professional life. I see them as a sanctuary, somewhere I can go that's private, where I include comments on the world, comments on my own personal life, my own emotions, experiments, a place where I can plan projects, books, exhibitions, lectures, films. I include details of exhibitions I've seen, books I'm reading. I find them very helpful, and I'm sure that most artists do.
Nicholas, you just mentioned the number yourself. You said you're looking back on 40 years with photography. That is an especially long time from the 80s to now, because so much has changed in photography. I mean, when I think back, there used to be these little Photoshops everywhere. And when you look at photography now, an entire world of photography has disappeared. I mean, I still remember this moment when it became clear there will be no more Agfa films. Wow. I mean, that was quite a moment. So your career comprises analog as well as digital photography. How did you handle this change from analog to digital?
I don't think I handled it well. I was too slow. I resisted it for too long. And I can see now that that was a mistake. I became a good analog photographer. I had good technique with the camera, with lighting, also in the darkroom with black and white printing. I became fluent with the Hasselblad, and I didn't want to give it all up for digital. And then suddenly, with the invention of smartphones, everyone became a photographer simply by buying a phone. You didn't need a darkroom or any knowledge of how to make prints. You didn't need to know how cameras worked, about aperture settings, shutter speed settings, light meters, color casts, etc. It was all done for you. Now it's almost impossible to think of people not taking photographs. So I found that I was losing work, losing status, being expected to master a new technology when younger photographers were able to adapt more easily and more quickly. I remember teaching students who knew far more than I did about digital, and that was quite hard to deal with. But the technology will always be changing, so every generation must learn to adapt. The important thing to remember is that technique is only part of the artistic process. It isn't what the arts are really about. It enables the message to be transmitted, it plays its part, but it isn't at the heart of what we do.
And what do we mean by that, the heart of what we do? What do you see as the job of artists in society?
That's not an easy question. And I'm fairly confident that whatever I say, somebody will disagree with, but I'll have a shot at it anyway. I think we make work as a way of trying to find our place in the world, understanding ourselves. We're looking for a tangible expression of how we feel, and that's why we make work. It's why people write songs or learn to dance. These are forms of expression that enable more complexity and more subtlety than our daily lives offer us. I think the great works of art help us to experience our lives in a more profound way, to connect with the more profound feelings we have as humans. They arrest us. They challenge our preconceptions about the world. And if you're lucky enough to have stood in front of a late Rembrandt self-portrait, or if you've ever listened to Aretha Franklin or John Coltrane, then you'll know what I mean. But the arts are also an indicator of a society's spiritual, emotional, intellectual health. So the more active and diverse the artistic activity, the healthier that society will be. William Blake, the English poet, said, "When the arts decline, nations decay." And that's a powerful statement, and I think there's some truth in it. It's why dictators, when they come to power, censor the arts. They don't want us to see what's really going on, and the arts help us to do that.
Yeah, thank you for telling us all this. I find this so fascinating and interesting, and I'm wondering, a lot of young people listen to this podcast, and what would be your advice for those who set out now, for those who decide to dedicate their life to art or photography right now?
I'm reluctant to give advice about photography because what worked for me may not work for someone starting out today. But perhaps I can make a few suggestions, things to consider, things I wish I'd been more conscious of when I was young, but they are only suggestions. Stay open to everything at the start of your career. Careers don't arrive fully formed. You have to build them slowly over time. Perhaps you don't know where to begin. It may be that you don't find your voice straight away. It may take time to discover what you really want to say. So stay open and consider different options. I went from training as a painter at university to having a brief career as a musician to ending up as a photographer. So my early career wasn't straightforward. It took me time to discover what I wanted to do. Have a good balance in your life between practicality and idealism, practical ways to pay your rent, and the courage to go forward as an artist. Look at other art forms and learn from them. Remember that the arts are all interrelated. They all come from the same place. They all use the same principles. They all rely on variations of the same aesthetics. Artists will choose a discipline that works for their own personality and for their own particular time in history, but we're all doing the same thing. Whether it's Beethoven or Jimi Hendrix, Sylvia Plath or Margaret Atwood, we're all expressing something about humanity and finding our own way to do it. Work hard. Talk to any professional artist, a dancer, a musician, a writer, a painter. They will all tell you the same thing. Hard work pays off. The English novelist Graham Greene said he wrote 300 words every single day of his life. Don't feel that you always have to play safe in your work. Be prepared to take risks. Be prepared to fail. If you always play safe, the work becomes predictable and less interesting. If you fail, then you can learn from that failure. You can sometimes retrieve a result from a failure too. I will often begin a photo shoot by taking safe pictures, but then I'll begin to experiment and try things that don't work, and it's often in the moments when you're taking risks that the best work emerges. Don't feel that you have to please people with your work. Have the courage to go off in a different direction. Trying to please people puts you on the back foot because you're waiting for their approval, and this normally results in mediocre work because you're trying to second guess what they want to see as opposed to following your instinct. Create situations where chance can enter into the creative process. Remember that chance and mistakes can give you your best pictures. Chance is like magic. It gives you unexpected results that can be better than anything you could have planned yourself. Treat mistakes as gifts. See their magic. See how they can enrich the work. I remember very early in my career going to the Spanish National Circus, and I took my camera with me. And at one point in the performance, all the lights went out. We were in complete darkness, and then a single spotlight came on, and it was directed at a Spanish trapeze artist. And she was spinning very fast on a rope, and she was casting a shadow up onto the roof of the tent. Now, because of the speed with which she was moving, I had no idea if I was able to take a decent photograph or not. I took 4 photographs. One of them turned out to be one of the best pictures I've ever taken. And that was a real lesson to me early on. Let chance enter into the creative process. Remember that your heart is your best guide. It's more accurate than your head. I will always place instinct above intellect. Other people may disagree, of course. Probably thousands of people would disagree with what I've just said. But for me, instinct is more trustworthy than the intellect. Learn to read people. Be aware of people's motives. What are they really saying? What do they really mean? What do they really want? Don't be too trusting of people, especially when you first meet them. Even now, after a 40-year career, I still find myself surprised. And when you're young and first starting out, people will look for opportunities to take advantage of you. There's a saying that's, I think, worth quoting here. In life, you get not what you're worth, but what you negotiate. So learn to negotiate well. And by that, I don't mean be greedy. Simply negotiate so that you feel you're being fairly treated. And finally, I would say think of the arts as being like oxygen. Take in everything that enriches you. Music, painting, sculpture, photography, theatre, cinema, poetry, literature, dance, architecture, fashion design. It all interrelates, it all feeds you, and it all makes life fascinating and wonderful.
Exercise.
I'm going to finish this podcast by giving you a practical exercise to carry out, bringing in some of the things that we've discussed. I want you to take a portrait of someone in their own home or in their place of work, and the brief is this. Find a background for the portrait that tells us something about that person, but that doesn't distract from their character. It needs to achieve a balance between giving information, but also remaining quite neutral. Find an expression in the person's face that engages us and tells us something about them. Not a fixed smile. Not a false look of everything is good with the world when we clearly know it isn't. Not an I'm a continually happy person, because none of us are. But a look that feels authentic and real and that gives us a clue to the person's character. I want you to find lighting that gives us both atmosphere and enough light on the face so that we can see the person's eyes. Clothes that don't confuse the situation. My advice is to go for simplicity. I tend to eliminate everything that distracts in a portrait. And finally, leave space for the viewer to bring their own imagination to the picture. Now this, I know, is a lot to ask. It won't be easy, but try it, and good luck.
The Artist's Toolkit. Conceptualized and presented by Kaethe Wenzel. Assistance, Nadia Driller. A project by European University Flensburg.